Howdy, my fellow Americans and my non-Americans. For over 200 years, the US of A has been spreading freedom and downing hamburgers. And we have gone through our fair share of presidents in that time. Some faster than others. And we're coming up on our 47th exactly. And I have taken it upon myself as some random person on the internet to rank every single president from S tier down to F tier. I will be judging on how influential and impactful the president was during their time in a good, positive manner. I will try to take into account the era and the feasibility of some tasks as well. I will also be including timestamps for every single president for those of you who just want to hear my opinion on Donald Trump. I know some of y'all are here for that. Now let me quickly lay some ground rules. These are just my opinions. I do not know everything about every president. View this as more of a way to learn some cool facts about every president. Because each of these guys could take an entire video themselves. And it's okay if you disagree with me. Let's keep the comment section civil, shall we? Okay, president number 1, George Washington, one of our 4 founding fathers. The other 3 I assume were Ronald McDonald, an apple pie wielding a Colt 1911, and a bald eagle just covered in oil. The OG GW, the man who led the revolutionaries during our war for independence, and the man who crossed the Delaware. Hey George, do you think you could stop posing for a sec and help paddle? This was our first president here in the States, and he could have made the position anything he wanted to. He could have been called emperor, or king, or even poobah, but he went with the more humble term of president. He set the precedent of presidents serving 2 terms maximum. Well, until somebody mucked that up. He hated parties. Well, the political parties. And he warned against aligning with any of them. Oh wow, that lasted. Thanks, politicians. He gave the first inaugural address and the first State of the Union, emphasizing that the position of president is about accountability and responsibility to the people, rather than a position of power over said people. In this State of the Union, he spoke on the need for a strong military and military readiness, a stable economy and public credit, and the importance of science and education in the role of a developing nation. Well, 1 out of 3 of those ain't bad. And he did much more than that, but we have like 45 other presidents to get through, so let me just say, I really like George Washington as a president. Was he perfect? Absolutely not. You could definitely argue against some of the decisions that he made in his 8 years as president, but it's clear that he carefully considered how his actions would affect this new leadership position for a new nation. So I'm going to give Washington an S. Next up, John Adams. This man was not only the 2nd president, but also the 1st vice president under George Washington. Alright, so let's see, what did he do when he got into office? He exposed the XYZ affair. No, really, that's what it's called. Come on, guys, you gotta be a little bit more creative when you're naming these things. XYZ affair sounds like a Yu-Gi-Oh card, not a political incident. So to make a long story short, in this affair, Adams exposed a few French agents named X, Y, and Z. Thus the name. These agents were demanding bribes from the US before negotiations with France could begin to lower some tensions that had been rising between the two of us. France really didn't like that the US was forming ties with England, their historic enemies. And so the French began to mess with our boats. And if there's one thing you don't do, it's mess with the US's boats. One thing led to another, a quasi-war was started, and Adams then strengthened our Navy, commissioned new warships, and even created the Department of the Navy. And in 1800, Adams avoided full-blown war and negotiated peace. Wow, this guy actually sounds pretty cool. I may just have to put him in S tier, but let's see, what else did he do? As you can see by this, Adams only served 1 term, and that means he wasn't popular enough to win re-election. And this was partially due to the Alien Sedition Act of 1798. During the Quasi-War, he made it much more difficult for immigrants to become citizens of the US, and even made it so that the president could deport any non-citizen that they thought was too dangerous. And on top of that, he made it a crime to print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writings about the government. Which sounds reasonable until you realize it really was only enforced on one political side, which then it starts to sound a little fishy. So on one hand, he avoided a full-blown war, strengthened our military and navy, to which we still do to this day. But on the other hand, he pressured against immigrants and limited free speech. Come on, Adams, that's the First Amendment, how did you miss that? With that, I'll give him a B. Next is Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson is probably best known for 2 things: the Louisiana Purchase, No, not that Louisiana. This one. And the Lewis and Clark Expedition. With the purchase, Jefferson doubled the size of the United States of America at the time for a measly $15 million. And with the expedition, the U.S. gained a ton of new geographical information and established relationships with the natives of the area. His lesser-known achievements include the reduction of the national debt by cutting spending. One way he did this was by reducing the size of the military, but he didn't touch the Navy because he had pirates to fight. During his presidency, he demonstrated the naval strength by defeating the Barbary pirates of North Africa, which were demanding tribute from American ships. This additionally showed the world that the U.S. was willing to protect its interests, even if abroad. A trend that we kept up for centuries. This sounds good and all, but remember that land that he purchased? Yeah, people lived there. Jefferson's policies with natives and slaves was a huge blemish during his presidency. Though he vocally advocated for equality and liberty, and even viewed the natives as equals, he in practice did not view their culture that way. And through coercion, he was able to acquire land from native tribes. This led to cultural erasure, and though Jefferson did not advocate for relocating natives, his actions laid the groundwork for this very thing later on. We'll get to you, Jackson, you crazy mofo. And that's not even mentioning his hypocrisy when it came to slavery. I mean, for somebody who wanted to include an entire paragraph in the Declaration of Independence condemning slavery, he sure did own a lot. While he likely couldn't have ended slavery or anything like that during his time, it would have been nice if he, freed his if he hated it so much. His actions had a huge impact on the U.S. militarily and geographically, but I can't give him an S tier because of the hypocrisy during his term, and so I'm going to give Jefferson an A. Number 4, James Madison. James Madison saw us through the War of 1812, which occurred during, 1812. The war started because somebody, Britain, wouldn't stop messing with our boats. Jesus, how hard is it not to touch our butts? I mean boats. While the war did end in a draw, it showed the world, yet again, not to mess with the US of A. And during this time, Madison saw weakness in our military and infrastructure. Thus, he pushed for building up our military and navy and improving national defense. However, like every war, this war was not perfect. The war increased tension with natives who sided with Britain during it because they wanted to resist westward expansion of the US. And after the war, he did push for further displacement of natives. He also implemented trade restrictions with Britain at that time, and surprise, it really didn't do too much besides harming the US economy. And worst of all, he failed to invade Canada during the war. That's it, you're going into B tier. We could have had amazing maple syrup, and Ryan Reynolds would have been an American-born national treasure. But no, you just had to go and screw that up. Number 5, James Monroe. This is the man that created the Monroe Doctrine. See how they share the same name? This declared the whole Western Hemisphere off limits to future European interference. This guy pretty much just called dibs on half of the entire planet. I'm surprised this man could fit inside of his pants because of how massive his balls were. He also endorsed improving infrastructure, addressed tensions over slavery with the Missouri Compromise, making Missouri a slave state, but made Maine a free state, and prohibited slavery above the 3630 latitude line in the Louisiana land. Well, except for Missouri. Well, aren't you special? He also acquired Florida from Spain. You can decide for yourself if that was a good or bad thing. And while he did reduce tensions over slavery during his term, it was kind of kicking that can of worms down the road for a future president to deal with. And he further pressured natives off their lands with unfair deals, setting the groundwork for something we'll get to soon. All things considered, I'll give him an A. Number 6, John Quincy Adams. I'm gonna be frank with y'all. I don't like this guy. First of all, he didn't win the popular vote, nor did he even win the most electoral votes. Wait, what the heck? John C. Calhoun was the running mate for 2 of the candidates? You can do that? Since no candidate in 1824 had the majority, the president was decided in the House, and this is where some corruption allegations start. The then Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, supported Adams and secured his win. And in return, Adams made Clay the Secretary of State. This alleged bargain fueled political division and tarnished Adams' reputation. He faced huge opposition in Congress, and the public at the time did not care for him either. And his economic actions further divide the North and South over slavery. But at least he supported education and science at the time, and he wanted to build better roads and canals. Let's put this guy in C tier. Next up, Andrew Jackson. If I was ranking based off of craziness, he'd be an S tier, easily. Let me just list a few things. He held a huge rowdy party after his election. So rowdy that he had to sneak out of the White House through the window. He dueled possibly hundreds of people before he became president. And he suffered so many injuries that you could hear his bones rattling like marbles, giving him the nickname Bag o' Marbles. He also survived an assassination attempt and proceeded to nearly beat the assassin to death with his cane. When he left office, he is credited with saying, "I have only two regrets. I didn't shoot Henry Clay, and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun." Y'all remember Clay, right? And Calhoun was his vice president during his first term. Jackson was one crazy MFer. But how was his presidency? He pushed for a more powerful executive branch, using his veto power often. He also surprisingly pushed for expanding voting rights. No, not to women or African Americans, don't be silly. But he did push for the removal of property requirements, allowing even more white men to vote. Hey, at the time, it's a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, he is best known for the Trail of Tears. You know, the forced migration of the Cherokee natives, leading to thousands of deaths, and one of the darkest chapters in our nation's history. There was also the economic panic of 1837 that occurred shortly after he left office, and was a direct result of his financial policies. I'll give Marbles here a low C tier. Next is Martin Van Buren. I'm gonna be honest, I don't have much to say about him, other than he has some mad facial hair. Work it, Martin! Van Buren's time suffered from the economic policies of Jackson, and his response was weak, though he did establish the independent treasury system. This was to separate government funds from private banks. Basically, he just wanted the government's money to be managed better, which makes sense to me. I think we can all agree on that. However, this did little to stop the panic, and he was seen as a weak leader at the time, especially when compared to Andrew freaking Jackson. He gets a low B. Up next, William Henry Harrison. Something seems weird about this term length. Yep, this man died in 1 month into his presidency. He thought it was a great idea to speak for over 2 hours in the rain without a hat or a coat during his inauguration speech. Then, 1 month later, he dies of pneumonia. But hey, thanks to him, we got to test out the President's Succession Act of 1792, which just states that the vice president takes over if the president dies during his term. So there's that. F tier. You don't get points for not being around long enough to not screw something up. Wear a coat, people. John Tyler, you're next. Taking over after Harrison, he annexed Texas, adding it to the Union. You can decide for yourself if that's a good or bad thing. And adding this new territory increased tensions between the North and the South, something Tyler did little to mend. Sure hope this division doesn't lead to anything. He didn't work well with Congress either, and there's not really much else I want to talk about with him, so I'm gonna give him a B tier. Next, Polk. This man is responsible for getting the main body of the USA to look how we all know and love. Except for this piece of land, but we'll get to you later, Gadsden Purchase. Signing the Oregon Treaty and winning the Mexican-American War, America now reached from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Overall, he was a strong leader, overseeing political and military dealings to the US's advantage. The main issue that came with this expansion was, of course, slavery. Polk's administration did little to address how slavery would be handled in these new territories. Well, there was the Wilmot Proviso, which banned slavery in any territories gained from Mexico. But that only fanned the flames from the South further, and Polk didn't even support it. Come on, guys, stop kicking this can down the road. Even England banned slavery 10 years earlier. This does not end well. But all things considered, I think I can give him an A tier. Now it's time for Zachary Taylor. Alright, let's see here. Oh, come on, guys, stop dying in office. Taylor was president for just a little over a year, but in that time, he stood against the expansion of slavery while trying to maintain the Union. When the Compromise of 1850 came up, he opposed it, seeing it open the door to future slave states, and it would create the Fugitive Slave Act, denying the freedom for many runaway slaves. If he lived longer, things may have developed differently, but if ifs and buts were cherries and nuts, he'd get a higher spot on the tier list. D tier. At least he lived longer than 1 month. After he kicked the bucket, Millard Fillmore took his place. He oversaw the Compromise of 1850, admitting California to the Union. You can decide for yourself if that's a good or a bad thing. It also added Utah and New Mexico as territories, strengthened the Fugitive Slave Acts, but made the slave trade illegal in D.C., but not slavery itself. All in all, Fillmore viewed himself as a mediator. He didn't push for or against slavery, he just wanted to delay that issue. Yep, just keep kicking that can down the road, guys. Come on, guys, even France figured out that slavery should be abolished in 1848. Oh, I should also mention he sent Matthew Perry to Japan to open trade with them. All in all, he was a weak leader who just wanted to avoid the tensions around slavery to reach their inevitable conclusion just yet. Yeah, I'm gonna have to give him a C tier. Alright, next up, Franklin Pierce. This is the man who made the continental United States look how we all know it to look. Well, except for Alaska. See, I told you we'd get back to the Gadsden Purchase. Pierce oversaw this purchase from Mexico, and this allowed for the construction of the Southern Transcontinental Railroad. He also improved relations with Japan with the Treaty of Kanagawa, and this led to Japan opening up its ports to American trade. Now, let's see how he handled the issue with slavery. Oh no, he signed the Nebraska Act, which, if you remember, prevented some land from allowing slavery. This led to violent fights between pro- and anti-slavery Kansas settlers called Bleeding Kansas, and he further enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. I mean, by this point, the writing is clearly on the wall that slavery is on the way out, not to mention that it's wrong. So it boggles the mind that a president would take action to reinforce it. Oh yeah, and there was also the Ostend Manifesto, a secret proposal that suggested that we should buy Cuba, and if that failed, we should just take it by force from Spain. Come on guys, it's right there, and Spain's all the way over there. They can't stop us. This was widely condemned, especially up north, because 1, potentially starting a war is bad, and 2, it was seen as a way to expand slavery into new US territories. Pierce eventually did abandon this plan, but only after it got backlash. So yeah, Pierce definitely fanned the flames that divided the North and South, so I'm gonna have to give him a D. Next up, James Buchanan. So remember that Ostend Manifesto from literally just a minute ago? Well, Buchanan was one of its authors. Oh great, here we go. What can I say that was good about him? He didn't blow up the planet while he was in office. That's about it. Yeah, Buchanan sucked. He supported the Dred Scott decision, which ruled that African Americans were not U.S. citizens, and that Congress could not stop slavery in U.S. territories, and declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. He also showed a bias towards the South and slavery. Get ready, Lincoln. We all know what's coming next. Buchanan also did nothing about the calls for secession, and did very little, if anything at all, to prepare for the obvious coming of the Civil War. I doubt this man could do anything to stop it during his time, but his inaction is just sad. I'll give him a D, because at least he didn't die 1 month into his presidency. Okay, Lincoln, you're up. I mean, you know him, I know him, we all know who this is. He freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, pushed for the adoption of the 13th Amendment before his untimely death. He encouraged westward expansion with the Homestead Act, signed the Transcontinental Railroad Act, established the national banking system, and most importantly, he wore a pretty cool hat. Was he perfect? No. He detained people without trial during the war, faced military setbacks, and technically he left the door open for slavery to continue with the Emancipation Proclamation if the South surrendered and rejoined the Union. You see, the proclamation stated that all slaves in the rebelling states would be freed on January 1st, 1863. So if the states rejoined before that date, the slaves there wouldn't be freed. Not to mention the slaves in states that didn't leave the Union but did allow slavery, like Kentucky. Slavery still would have likely been abolished soon afterwards, but this may have made it more difficult for the 13th Amendment to be ratified in this alternate universe. Just imagine how much more this man could have gotten done in his second term, but we'll never know thanks to John Wilkes Booth. But all that said, Lincoln clearly gets an S tier. It's a shame he didn't get to finish his second term, but instead that was led by our next man, Andrew Johnson. Abraham Lincoln, this man, was not. This is the man that oversaw the southern states rejoining the Union, as well as overseeing the purchase of Alaska from Russia. Sir, there is nothing here but snow, trees, and some weird black goo in the ground. Ew. Okay, we sell it to those Americans. He was somewhat lenient on the southern states, allowing them to rejoin the Union if they, 1, swore loyalty to the Union, and 2, abolished slavery. A pretty good deal, I say. However, Johnson did little to prevent the former Confederate leaders from undermining the rights of the now freed slaves of the South. Surprise, surprise, the leaders that fought to keep slaves didn't really care too much about protecting their newly acquired rights. He also vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. which gave African American citizenship and equal protection under the law. Fortunately, Congress overrode that veto. He also vetoed a bill that would provide aid to the newly freed African Americans, called the Freeman Bureau's Bill. This veto, too, was eventually overruled. Good job, Congress. And then there were the Black Codes in the South, which restricted the rights of African Americans in the South, and again, Johnson did very little, if anything, to prevent these. And also, he was the first president to be impeached, but he avoided being kicked out of office by a single vote. Sure, he got the southern states back into the Union, but he did very little to protect the rights of African Americans that now had freedom, so I'm gonna have to give him a D tier. Next up is Grant. Grant was pretty good in my opinion. I sure hope they didn't take him for granted back in the day. He supported the 15th Amendment, which prohibited voting discrimination based off of race. During his time, he also temporarily dismantled the KKK, and he also worked to protect the rights of African Americans and get them equal treatment in the US as best he could at the time. His term presided over a period of rapid industrialization, and during this time, he wanted to improve relations with Native Americans. There was some economic issues during the time, but overall, he was pretty good. That's an easy A tier. Next up, Rutherford B Hayes. Hayes becoming president effectively ended the Reconstruction of the South. It's a whole thing I'm not going to go into, but upon his election, the withdrawal of all the federal troops in the South began. While on one hand, this is a good step for the nation, but on the other hand, it opened the door for some nasty policies, which we'll get into. But first, the good that he did. He had a stable economy and even reduced inflation during his time. Oh, that must be nice. And he promoted national unity. You can't spell union without the first three letters in unity. But then came the Jim Crow laws. You see, after Reconstruction, he was hoping that local governments would work to protect the rights of African Americans. But instead, they pushed for racial segregation. He was a bit too hands-off around those issues during his time. So I'll give him a B tier. Alright, next up, James Andrew Garfield. No, wait, Andrew Garfield's the actor. What? I wrote Andrew Garfield. The A stands for Abrams, not Andrew. This one didn't really get much done because, you guessed it, he died in office. Garfield was shot on July 2nd, 1881, by Charles Guiteau. It's a crazy story, but Charles thought that he was the sole reason that Garfield even got elected to president. And he was so upset that he didn't get a position in government for all the work that he did, when all he did was write a paper that nobody probably read. Garfield died 2 months later due to infection, likely due to doctors just digging around in his wound with their unwashed hands. And yes, I can't make this up, but he did die on a Monday. Man, no wonder Garfield hates Mondays. Considering he was only president for 4 months until he was bedridden, I'm gonna have to give him an F tier. Oh, and fun fact, Garfield's great-great-grandson, Richard Garfield, would later create Magic the Gathering. Next up, Chester A. Arthur. Arthur pushed for modernizing the Navy, seeing that boats were pretty important. He also set up a merit-based system for hiring federal employees, which to me is kind of a no-brainer, but hey, I'm glad it got done. I don't really have a strong opinion on him one way or the other, so he gets a B. Next, Grover Cleveland. This man reduced the national debt, cut unnecessary spending, and even had a surplus of federal funds during his time. This man knew money. Though there was the economic panic of 1893 during his time, he also took a stand against British imperialism during the Venezuela crisis of 1895. Remember that Monroe Doctrine? Yeah, Europe, the Western Hemisphere, is off limits. He was very anti-big government, and this did lead to him being against some social programs, such as federal assistance for veterans and the poor, but all in all, I'll give him an A. Benjamin Harrison, you're up. Harris was anti-monopoly and against anti-competitive practices in big businesses, and thus passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. Nobody tell him about Monopoly Go on the App Store. He would hate it. It also sucks anyway, so don't download it. He also started the process of annexing Hawaii. You can decide for yourself if that's a good or a bad thing. He increased pensions for vets of the Civil War and supported civil rights, like protecting African Americans' right to vote. That's a good thing. He was not too successful protecting these rights due to Congress at the time, but hey, at least he tried. I'm gonna give him a high B. The next president is Grover Cleveland. Wait, what? We already did him. Yeah, so Cleveland served one term, then he lost re-election, but then he ran again after Harrison and won, And he's the only president to do this, by the way. Well, until, I already spoke on Cleveland, so next up, William McKinley. This man oversaw the Spanish-American War, which we won, by the way. This not only added Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as American territories, this also established the U.S. as an emerging world power. Don't go starting a world war in 16 years, Europe. We might just have to get involved. The economy was also pretty good during his presidency. However, there were two teeny-weeny little issues during his time. One was that he did very little to quell racial tensions and growing violence against African Americans. And two, he was assassinated. He finished his first term, but 6 months later, he was assassinated. Oh my god, this whole being president thing is pretty dangerous. He at least finished his first term, so he gets a B. One good thing did come from his assassination, though. That being Theodore Roosevelt's first term. One of, if not the manliest president to ever grace the White House. He broke up monopolies and supported safer food and drugs. That's how you push for better foods and drugs without being a vaccine skeptic. He adored nature and established 5 national parks, and oversaw the start of the construction of the Panama Canal. Oh yeah, he also won a Nobel Peace Prize. This man was awesome. He even spoke out against lynching and racial violence that had been occurring. However, one thing against him was that he did very little to curb these events, which did disappoint many even at the time. Originally, I was going to give him an A, but while writing this, I decided, hey, why not? He gets an S tier. Next is William Howard Taft. Taft was kind of like Teddy, except way bigger. He was so big, he needed a custom-made bathtub. And from that bathtub, he continued trust-busting and conservation efforts like Teddy. He wasn't really as good of a leader, nor as charismatic as Teddy. I mean, who can compete with that smile? And while he did have similar goals as Teddy, he wasn't as committed to them. So I'm going to give him a low A tier. Next enters Woodrow Wilson. Let's just get the obvious out of the way first. He was the president during World War I. Initially, he wanted to stay out of it, which is fair. We're all the way over here, and the war is all the way over there. It was a European issue, and it didn't involve the US. However, after Germany continued to attack US ships, and tried to get Mexico to join them against us, I think he made the right call in joining. He even worked to establish the League of Nations after the war ended. Oh wow, that did not last long. But he did get a Nobel Prize for it. All that's good, but there's a bit more to him. Woodrow Wilson was, to put it lightly, a bit of a racist. He did little to address the Jim Crow laws, played Birth of the Nation in the White House, and he segregated the federal government. Oh, and also his presidency might have created the Espionage Acts, which did limit free speech. Come on, Wilson, it's the First Amendment. How do you miss that? Hey, you already made that joke. Yeah, sure, he'll get some points because of World War I, but I'm gonna have to give him a C. Now, for Warren G. Harding. Oh, great. Another one that died in office. Yeah, so 2 years into his term, he was killed by heart. I mean, his heart. He died of a heart attack. But what he's most known for are the numerous scandals and corruption of his cabinet. Corruption and not even finishing your first term is not good. I'm gonna have to give him a D. Take care of your heart, people. We're on to the big 3-0, Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge was okay, and he also oversaw the Roaring '20s, a time of great economic growth. I sure hope that doesn't end badly. He was a very hands-off president and pro-business. He actually talked so little that he got the nickname Silent Cal. Who knew politicians could actually be silent? He addressed the NAACP to improve relations with African Americans. The N stands for national, by the way, not whatever this guy is thinking. And while Congress opposed the anti-lynching laws, I'm not going to hold that against him as president. I mean, at least he tried. Oh hey, look, he also gave Native Americans citizenship. Well, that's neat. On the flip side, depending on who you ask, his policies may or may not have directly led to the Great Depression that occurred soon after his presidency ended. So considering that, and all the good he did, and his hands-off nature, I guess I can give him a B. Alright, next up, Herbert Hoover. From the name, you can guess that, yes, he initiated the construction of the Hoover Dam. No, not dam as in the curse word YouTube, dam as in the hydroelectric device. Dam, the Hoover Dam Why are you censoring that? God damn it! On the other side of this Hoover-shaped coin was the Great Depression. While he may not have caused the Great Depression, as it started just a few months after he took office, he did little to try to stabilize the economy, as he felt that federal aid would lead to dependency on the government and lower individual initiative. Okay, Andrew Ryan. It was so bad that homeless encampments at the time were called Hoovervilles, which, believe it or not, directly influenced Dr. Seuss when naming Whoville in Horton Hears a Who. That's completely made up, but I bet I got at least one of you to think that was real for at least a second. Oh, and did I forget to mention the time he let loose the army on veterans protesting in Washington, D.C., using tanks and tear gas to disperse them? These are the people who, fought in a war literally not too long ago at the time. Oh yeah, what a great way to treat your veterans. Yep, that's gonna have to be a D tier from me. Now for another big one. Franklin D. Roosevelt. This is the man that held office for over 10 years for 4 terms. He oversaw the recovery during the Great Depression and set up many social programs such as Social Security. During these difficult times, he was an inspiring leader to many Americans and communicated directly to the American people with his famous fireside chats, where he would talk about his policies. Oh my god, this guy would have loved Twitter. He would have been tweeting every hour on the hour. He also oversaw the US at the beginning of World War II, sending support and weapons to our allies before the events of Pearl Harbor, and then directly getting the US involved in the war, leading to D-Day and the Pacific Theater. If I was to leave it at that, this guy would be an easy S tier. Unfortunately for him, there's a bit more to him. During the Great Depression, he did threaten to pack the Supreme Court. He wanted to add like 6 new seats to it. Oh man, I am sure glad that has never been threatened before. He also executed Order 66. No, wait, I read that wrong. He enacted Executive Order 9066, which allowed the internment of over 120,000 innocent Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, because of the fear that some of them might be spies. Over half of the people in these camps were children, and no spies were ever found. Man, I am so glad we don't imprison innocent children anymore. Depending on how effective you think his policies were in getting the US out of the Great Depression, he could really be anywhere on this list. Personally, I think he did alright, and he did undo prohibition, so that's nice. But the other stuff is gonna have to make me put him in B tier. Next is Harry Truman. This is the man that saw us out of World War II and dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. You can decide for yourself if that was a good or a bad thing. He provided billions of dollars to help rebuild Europe after the war with the Marshall Plan, helped to establish NATO, desegregated the military, passed anti-lynching laws, and supported establishing the UN. I kinda like the guy, but he ain't perfect. He kind of bungled the Korean War, and his policies intended to fight communism did lead to the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism. Everyone became afraid of who may or may not just be a dirty, dirty communist. Anyone could be a commie. Your senator, your favorite actor, your parents, maybe even your dog. I think he still did a lot of good, so I'm gonna give him a A. Eisenhower time. I gotta be honest, I like Ike. This man ended the Korean War, established the construction of the international highway system, navigated us so well through the Cold War that he avoided any other major military conflicts like the Korean War. Also, fun fact, did you know that the show MASH, which took place during the Korean War, lasted longer than the Korean War itself? Anyone who knows that show is legally obligated to share that fun fact. Ike also oversaw the post-war economic boom, desegregated schools, signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and established NASA. On the negative side, I guess you could say he didn't do enough to combat the hysterical fear of communism that was plaguing America at the time. Oh, and he also did support some overseas operations by the CIA to overthrow governments in Iran and Guatemala. So there's also that. All in all, though, I'm gonna have to give Ike an A. Alright, JFK, you're up. Oh, great, another president to die in office. But, and this may surprise y'all, I'm not gonna give him a low grade for that. And let me just set the record straight. The FBI did not kill JFK. We all know it was John Wilkes Booth back from the grave, right? One president just was not enough for him. And I mean, JFK was riding around in a Lincoln brand car. How could Booth resist? JFK famously saw us through the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he also did fumble the ball on the Bay of Pigs invasion. He accelerated NASA's efforts, and while he didn't live to see it, he pushed America to aim for the moon with his "We choose to go to the moon" quote. He also supported the civil rights movements and established the Peace Corps. While the Cold War tensions definitely rose during his presidency, I think he navigated us through it pretty well, but he definitely had a few missteps here and there. A low A for JFK. All right, Lyndon B. Johnson, your turn. This is the man that got U.S. boots on the ground in the Vietnam War with Operation Rolling Thunder, a war that was widely criticized then and even now. The man was also a bit racist. I mean, he called the Civil Rights Bill of 1957 the N-word bill. Yeah, except he actually said the word. But as president, he did pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and banned racial discrimination in voting. Johnson was a complicated guy. He established Medicare and Medicaid and expanded funding for education. He also pushed for continued space exploration. He did a lot of good as president. But am I going to give the president who constantly whipped his dick out an A? Yeah, the president named Johnson loved talking about his Johnson. Yeah, he gets an A. Next up, Nixon. It's because of this guy that every corruption conspiracy has to include the word gate. Gamergate, Pizzagate, Oceangate. This makes no sense, people. It was called Watergate because of the building named Watergate. I should give him an F tier for all of the stupidity I have to see online about that, but I won't do that. And yes, if you didn't already know, because of the Watergate scandal, Nixon is the only president to resign from office. Where Nixon's campaign was caught breaking into the DNC headquarters, as well as other illegal actions conducted by White House officials. It's a whole thing. I'm not going to go into all of it. Just know that it was really bad. His term also suffered from heavy inflation, but very little economic growth. On the positive side, he did get us on the moon, improved our relationship with China, signed the Clean Air and Water Acts, and fought against continued segregation in the school system. Yeah, school segregation was already made illegal, but some places found ways around that. It's a whole nother thing. So Nixon was bad, but he wasn't all bad. So I'm gonna have to give him a low C. Next, we have Gerald Ford. Alright, let's see, what did he do? It says here he pardoned Nixon of all crimes. Alright, so we're off to a rough start. He viewed this pardon as necessary to lower tensions. But I don't know, that just doesn't sound like justice to me. Ford also worked to lower inflation by cutting spending and also pushed citizens to save a little bit more money. Wow, if people stop spending money on things, prices for goods won't go up as much. Who knew? Yeah, I'm sure asking nicely will fix everything. These policies obviously had limited impacts, but hey, at least he tried. He also signed Title IX into law, which prohibited discrimination based off of sex in education. And while my next point has literally nothing to do with his ranking, this man had 2 assassination attempts on his life. People did not like him. He's definitely better than Nixon, so I'll give him a high C. Jimmy Carter time. Let's get the good out of the way first. He brokered peace between Egypt and Israel in 1978 with the Camp David Accords, improved relations with Latin America when he relinquished control of the Panama Canal to Panama, established the Department of Energy, and pushed for more renewable energies and set up many national parks. Teddy would be so proud. Now for the bad. Unemployment and interest rates were sky high when he was president. But what you probably know him best for was his handling of the Iran hostage crisis. In 1979, Iranian students captured the U.S. embassy stationed in Tehran, a location best known for its use in the hit film SpongeBob Goes to Tehran. 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days. And in 1980, the U.S. military attempted a rescue operation known as Operation Eagle Claw. This unfortunately failed and resulted in the death of 8 U.S. servicemen. He was not a strong leader for the time. So I gotta give him a C. But hey, eventually he did get a Nobel Peace Prize for promoting peace all over the world for the work he did after his presidency. So, there's that. Not going to affect its ranking, but worth mentioning. Okay, we have officially reached the Reagan zone. Starting here, people begin to have really strong opinions, so let's keep it civil in the comments. Oh, and while you're down there, like the video and subscribe. If I was grading on Reagan's comedic skills, he'd be an easy S tier. Unfortunately, I'm not grading him on his wit. Let's start with the good. And contrary to what Reddit might tell you, there are some good things that Reagan did. He took a hard stance against the Soviet Union, yet still engaged with negotiations with the at-the-time leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev. He also reduced the large amount of cheese that the US had stockpiled. Yeah, it's a long story, but we had over 500 million pounds of cheese stored up that we were just holding on to because we had to keep subsidizing milk farmers after Prohibition ended. But by reducing the amount that we were storing, we did save money on how much we were spending on storing said cheese. And that's all the good I'm going to mention about Reagan. On to the bad. He implemented Reaganomics, which were trickle-down economic policies that cut taxes for the rich. While it may have decreased unemployment and increased economic growth at the time, it has had more harmful effects long-term in my opinion. He also started the war on drugs, which focused on harsher sentencing for drug offenses related to drugs such as marijuana and cocaine, rather than preventative measures or rehabilitation. And we all know how that war went. He cut welfare programs, and he severely mishandled the AIDS crisis with how slow to act he was on addressing it. Oh, and he also tripled the national debt during his time. Yeah, Reagan's gonna get a C. Okay, now for George H. Bush. Out of all the presidents after Reagan, this is the one I hear the least about. And honestly, I kinda get it. Not much to talk about. He was in charge during the fall of the Soviet Union, supported reunifying East and West Germany, won us the Persian Gulf War. This was when Iraq under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. But during Operation Desert Storm, the US and her allies liberated Kuwait. And this was before Saddam Hussein met his better half down in the underworld. He started negotiations with Canada and Mexico to establish NAFTA, which would reduce trade barriers between the three countries making up the North American continent. He also passed the American Disabilities Act, which prohibited discrimination based on disability. While he did lead the US during a recession, and failed to remove Saddam Hussein after the Persian Gulf War, I think he did pretty good. A tier for H. Bush. Oh boy, up next is Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was the best president ever, and he never did anything wrong. He gets a well-deserved S tier. Okay, now that that's gone, under Clinton, which is how he likes it, the US experienced a long economic boom, and unemployment fell to a 30-year low. And he even managed to lower the national debt. He signed NAFTA in 1993 and supported further trade agreements such as having China join the World Trade Organization. And he even reduced crime with the construction of new prisons and crime preventive measures. On the other hand, that led to increased mass incarcerations, which we still feel the effects of today. His administration also failed to properly address the rising threat of Al-Qaeda, and we all know what that eventually led to. And yes, there's also the Monica Lewinsky scandal, where President Clinton had an affair with his at-the-time intern. It kinda looks bad when a boss has an affair with someone he has direct authority over, and this is why we all have to deal with HR. Stuff like this. This scandal eventually led to his impeachment, but he was acquitted. Even taking the scandal into account, he did some good and some bad things. I think I'll give him a B. Yeah, a B. Bush 2 Electric Boogaloo. Alright, let's get the main thing that is synonymous with George W. out of the way first. The economy and the stock market. Many people like to blame Bush for the economic problems that he faced at the beginning and end of his 8 years as president. And while you could say he could have done more to help during those economic downturns, he really didn't cause them though. I mean, that dot-com bubble in 2000 pretty much popped before he took office, and no president could have fully stopped the housing market crash in 2008 in my opinion. Again, maybe another president would have done better, But honestly, presidents get too much praise for good economic periods and too much blame during bad economic periods. And I know that kind of hurts some of my points for the rankings of people on this list, but sue me, of course I know more about presidents closer to today than presidents hundreds of years ago. Oh yeah, there's also 9/11. And I just need to set the record straight again, Bush did not cause 9/11. He was all the way in Texas at the time. It was zombie John Wilkes Booth again. He came back from the grave, joined the terrorists, and then struck back at America once more. But as president during those attacks, Bush did a pretty good job rallying and addressing the nation during those times. However, he then did pass the U.S. Patriot Act. This led to an increase of surveillance on U.S. citizens. Oh, and he also set up Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay, the only detention center that sounds like a resort. Complimentary torture included with stay. Bush also launched the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which, while sounding like a really weird Pokemon, provided billions in global HIV and AIDS relief. And then there's the No Child Left Behind policy. This focused on improving education, especially for disadvantaged students. And sure, that sounds great, but its implementation was anything but good. All this did was push schools to care about getting good grades from students, rather than teaching and making sure the students really understood the material. Exams do not reflect understanding. I lived during this program, and it sucked. Bush also invaded Iraq because apparently they had weapons of mass destruction. Except, surprise, surprise, no they didn't. Then there's also the invasion of Afghanistan, which we only recently got out of. And of course, he hugely mishandled relief after Hurricane Katrina. Bush, you can't put a blanket over Louisiana and act like it didn't happen. I think he genuinely meant well for many of his actions, but I'm not grading on intention. Yeah, he's getting a low C. Your father, you were not, Mr. Cheerleader. Obama time. Regardless of how you may feel about Obama, can we just all agree that he was the last presidential acting president? He didn't eat McDonald's all the time or mess with hurricane maps all willy-nilly, nor did he seem to have his brain just shut down, or just be generally confused when he's taking a simple walk. Obama was the first president I actually remember hearing about when growing up. Sure, I was alive when Bush was president, but I didn't care about presidents at the time. I cared way more about dinosaurs. He killed Osama bin Laden, not personally I assume, but man, how cool would that be? He negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, which lifted sanctions and limited the country's nuclear program to prevent the development of nuclear weapons. The US at this time also joined the Paris Climate Agreement, and while I do fully support fighting climate change, to be honest, I'm not that big of a fan of it because it's just not effective enough. Good job, y'all shook hands. Now actually do something. Same-sex marriage became legal, and homosexuals were no longer barred from being able to serve in the military. They're gay, not blind. They can shoot somebody just like everybody else, and insult their wardrobe to add insult to injury. And then there's the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. And sure, it's definitely not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction to make sure that more people gain access to affordable health care. And we've seen how passionate people are about that recently. On the more negative side, I'll let Obama start us off.
I have 2 words for you. Predator drones.
Yeah, Obama used drone strikes about as much as I drink sweet tea. He launched over 500 strikes, 10 times more than Bush, leading to many foreign civilian casualties. Now, I'm sure they hit a lot of bad guys. But during his term, between 2.5 and 5% of those killed by the strikes were civilians. And 5% is still a lot. There's a lot more I could go into on drone strikes, but this video's long enough as it is. Just trust me, they were and possibly still are used way too much. Obama also failed on his promise to close Guantanamo and leave Afghanistan. And quite possibly, worst of all, he wore a tan suit. What the heck was he thinking? He better be glad I'm not grading on fashion or else he would get an F. Instead, I'm gonna have to give him a B. Oh, hang on a second, viewer. I have a message for those who skipped right to the part about Donald Trump. Oh wow, you really just jumped right to the Donald Trump segment. That's all you want to hear about? You don't want to hear about any of the other presidents. Okay, cool. See if I care. All right, Trump, you're up. But first, let me get the lights.
No, get those lights off! Off!
Donald Trump, the most memeable president. Let's start with the good. And again, contrary to what Reddit might say, there were some. Trump backed and hosted the Abraham Accords. which normalized relationships between Israel and multiple Arab nations, which pushed for improved trade, cultural exchange, and peace. And I know this is going to be a hot take, but I kinda like all of that. Some will say that this caused the Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023. And caused is the wrong word. It motivated it, sure. Hamas did not like that Israel was improving relations with surrounding nations. I'm not going to get into all the Israel stuff going on now, as that's a whole nother can of worms. But I don't think it's fair to blame a peace agreement for an attack led by a group who wouldn't like that potential peace. Trump also pressured NATO allies to increase their defense spending, though I will say he took that a little bit too far. And he passed the First Step Act, a bipartisan bill to reform federal sentencing, expand early release programs, and address mass incarceration in the US. Oh yeah, and he established the Space Force, and we probably need a military branch focused around space operations and security. But only time will tell if this works out or is taken way too far. Please no satellite weapons in the future. Please no satellite weapons in the future. Now for the bad. He was impeached twice, one after the January 6th riot, which he instigated. He also withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreements, and sure, I wasn't the biggest fan of the agreements, but you need to have an improved plan before leaving an old one. He also rolled back environmental protections and went back on the Iran nuclear deal. And then there's the border wall, which logistically makes no sense. It would be too expensive to build and maintain, not to mention that there is just some land that a border wall just cannot go through because there's American real estate there, like this golf course. We have borders for a reason, and illegal immigration is an issue that needs to be addressed, but a wall of that scale is not the solution. Then there's also how he addressed COVID in 2020. He would downplay how bad the virus was, would butt heads with scientists on issues related to the virus, and he would just not wear a mask for the longest time. When you're the president, you're supposed to be setting an example for the people to follow, thus undercutting the CDC recommendations. The response to getting tests available nationwide was also pretty poor. The pandemic was going to be a bad time, but it could have definitely gone better in the US. Oh, but I will say he gets some points for the accelerated development of the vaccine. And then there's the economic policies that he passed during his time. To be honest, it was doing well before he took office, and continued to do well after he took office. Except for the pandemic part, but again, kind of out of his control. So it's hard to say if he improved the economy, or he just didn't get in the way of the good things that we had going at the time. I'm no expert, I'm just a guy inside of your computer. I'm gonna give him a C. But it is a little early to know the full ripple effect of his presidency. Alright, Biden, you're up. No, Biden, this way. Biden, wrong way. Wrong way, this way, Biden. Biden is the oldest president of the United States ever. At least until Trump takes office again in a few days, because by the end of his second term, he'll have been the oldest president ever. Oh my god, why is everybody in government so old? They're not even gonna live long enough to see the impact of what they do in Congress. Biden's age was a point of contingency during his term. And yeah, that's fair, he wasn't all there at times. But what did he do in his 4 years as president? Well, he got us out of Afghanistan, and while it was far from perfect, at least he got it done, because I didn't think I was ever gonna see that in my lifetime. He also rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, we'll see how long that lasts, and he passed a huge $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. This covered roads, bridges, water systems, and even expanded the internet and improved the power grid. Have you seen our roads and power grid in America? This was long overdue. There was also the support provided to Ukraine during his term. I mean, his administration was on top of that day one. The invasion really wasn't even a surprise for them. And now for the elephant in the room. Inflation. Now I'm gonna piss some of y'all off with this because I don't actually blame Biden for the rise in inflation we're facing right now, nor do I blame Trump's previous term. The impact of the pandemic and the necessary actions to combat it all but guaranteed we were going to face some higher rates of inflation to come. But then on top of that, you add in the supply chain mishaps and the war in Ukraine disrupting oil and grain shipments early on, not to mention how difficult it is to reduce inflation like this while also avoiding a recession. Oh god, I really hope that doesn't age like milk. I'm honestly surprised it hasn't been worse. But that's not to say Biden made the situation better with anything he did himself. because I think he could have done a little bit more to help with the issue, especially in terms of using oil reserves early on in the Ukraine invasion. Honestly, I think we owe it not being worse to a mix of luck and to the work of the Fed. And yes, it's really comfortable sitting on this fence. And then there's the border issue, with illegal immigration reaching record highs during his term. Don't worry though, Kamala as vice president is gonna fix this.
Do not come.
Oh yeah, that'll help. Immigration is a whole nother thing, but let me just say, huge levels of illegal immigration is bad. Legal immigration is great. We've got a whole statute dedicated to that fact. Separating families, now that's bad. Maintaining our border while still helping those fleeing war as refugees is good. Alright, that's enough of that, I'm moving on. Okay, honestly, I expected to end it right here, but while writing this script, Joe Biden pardoned his son. I get it, you're his dad. He's your son. But my God, is that not a misuse of power? He even explicitly said he wasn't going to do that? That doesn't change my view on him too much, but I needed to mention it. With all that considered, Biden gets a high C. And all right, that's all the presidents, at least for now. This is not the ranking I was expecting to have before I started writing and researching, and I think the biggest takeaway from this is it's really hard to rank presidents. There were a lot of these guys that I went back and forth on. I mean, these guys served for years and years. Not you, though. And I summarized them in a few minutes each, at most. I'm sure I missed some things about all of them. Or I underweighted or overweighted certain impacts that they had during their presidency. But hey, at least I learned some new stuff while I was making the video. Like the fact that Garfield died on a Monday. I'm still not over that. I hope you learned something new in this video as well, and let me know how you would rank the presidents down in the comments. Please be civil though, and until the next video, stay awesome, y'all.